Welcome to Let the Quran Speak. I'm here with Khaled Beydoun. He's a law professor at Wayne State University and the leading intellectual on Islamophobia. Professor Khaled, welcome to Let the Quran Speak.
Thanks for having me.
I'm really excited about your new book, The New Crusades. So tell me about the process of writing this book.
Yeah. So it was like a 4 to 5 year long process to write the book. It started off with research, obviously, but a lot of on the ground travel, visiting places like India, China, France, Canada, various countries across the world, and speaking directly to individuals who had experienced Islamophobia in their home countries. So a lot of, in library study and research, but also a lot of exciting on the ground interviews, meeting people. And that was the most dynamic dimension of it.
So the interesting thing when I read your book is I was expecting an academic book. And then when I read it, I just thought, wow, this is so beautifully written. You are a writer, not just an academic. And it's wonderful because people expect very dry language and arguments, but you inject feeling into it and even talk about feelings in your book, which I didn't expect.
Yeah, and that's very generous of you to say. I mean, for me, writing these books is a project, but also a product that I want to resonate with general lay readers, right? I'm an academic and I have my own academic writing and research that is intended for professors. But yeah, these books is the central objective is to really educate people about what Islamophobia is, what it looks like in different countries. And the reason I inject my personal stories in it is because as a Muslim, I want to sort of illustrate how the emotions, the feelings, the real existential sort of struggles of being Muslim in a world where Islamophobia is pervasive actually looks like. And that's why, I'm reluctant to sort of like inject my personal stories, but I do that for that reason.
You describe Islamophobia as a neo-colonial global project, Khalid, right? And I'm wondering, what does that mean and who are the perpetrators of that, right? And what is their agenda?
Well, yeah, I think that's one strand or dimension of it. So for me, I lead with the idea that Islamophobia is an imperial project spearheaded in the modern context by the United States, this sort of global crusade, and that's why the book is called The New Crusades. But a global war on terror, where hatred, animus, fear of Muslims is sort of a central vehicle in expanding American influence through this war on terror, with the central objective. Number one, to access oil, expand American influence in the Middle East, but also places beyond. But through this process of empire and exporting Islamophobia as an American project, we see governments across the world also adopting the American language around Islamophobia, right? Conflating Muslims with terrorists.
You see that in China, for example.
China, India, across Europe and places like Sweden more recently. Also in Canada as well, right? Our neighbors, our friendly neighbors of the north. Yeah, so it's an imperial project in that regard, but it's far more than that, and I'm happy to talk about the additional dimensions.
So let's talk about the war on terror because you talk about that a lot in your book. But you also mentioned that Islamophobia is not a new phenomenon, right?
Yeah.
It's existed forever, basically. So what was it about the war on terror that kind of catapulted Islamophobia to a whole new level?
Yeah, so pre-existing the sort of modern emergence or advent of Islamophobia is this sort of system that existed before it called Orientalism, right? It's this idea that the Middle East, the Muslim world, the Orient is the antithesis of the West. So if the West was where civilization, modernity, progress was rife and pervasive, then the Middle East, the Muslim world had to be backwards, warmongering, violent, patriarchal, all these negative things, right? So after the 9/11 terror attacks, all these stereotypes that were deeply, embedded by Orientalism in Europe, but also in North America, were redeployed and then adapted in the image of terrorism, right? Because that's who Muslims essentially became in the post 9/11 context. We were associated with these terror culprits who commit the 9/11 terror attacks, but also these transnational terror organizations as well. So Islamophobia in many respects is the spawn, it's the progeny, it's the child of Orientalism. It's just adapted and molded in the modern context in the image of terrorism.
So Professor Khalid, you've been to so many different countries, right? And you've spoken
Unfortunately.
you've spoken to so many different people about their
Yeah.
experiences, the Rohingya, the Uyghurs. Is there any particular experience of Islamophobia that really hit you and you thought, whoa, this is the worst I've
Yeah.
ever seen or experienced or heard about?
Yeah, there's a number, right? And I'll lead with one case study. And the reason I chose the young woman on the cover of the book as the sort of image or face of the book is I was really taken by the experience of Uyghur Muslims,
Hmm.
facing mass persecution, facing genocide in their indigenous land of East Turkestan. And over the course of the last several years, I think I was one of the first American academics to really speak on that genocide publicly.
I also found it very dystopian, the whole Uyghur
Yeah,
situation. It's almost like you can't believe that this is actually happening.
yeah,
And when I first heard about it, I would have nightmares about it. I
yeah.
kept thinking about it over and over.
And that's a great word, right? Dystopian,
Yeah.
Orwellian, because you have Big Brother essentially watching every step, observing and monitoring how Uyghur Muslims, or oftentimes can be very devout Muslims, are practicing their faith. So
Hmm.
I was reading stories about how there's been a criminalization of Ramadan in East Turkestan. Uyghur can't observe Ramadan, and if they did, they'd be punished, and many of them would be shipped off to these concentration camps.
Hmm.
So over the course of the years, I had the chance to work really closely with many Uyghur leaders in the diaspora, specifically in Turkey,
Hmm.
and through building those relationships and hearing these really, vile, dire stories of enduring genocide, really stuck with me. And stand, in my opinion, is the most sort of horrific, nefarious manifestations of global Islamophobia.
Hmm. Hmm. Now, you've written so much about all these different cases, Khaled, in many different countries, and they're very touching, but they also leave you with a feeling when you're finished the book as, what do you do next? What
Yeah.
happens next? What's the solution to Islamophobia?
Mhm.
And I don't feel like you fully addressed that in your book. Of course, your
Yeah.
book wasn't about that. It was about sharing those experiences, right?
Yeah.
And weaving it in with theory. So what do you think is the solution? Of course, there is no easy solution. I
Yeah.
understand that. But how do you move forward to fight Islamophobia? Is it
Yeah.
government? Is it the media? Is it average Muslims who are responsible?
Mhm.
Who should be responsible?
Yeah, it's sort of like multi-layered as to what we do in terms of solving a beast that is so grand and so ominous in nature, right? There's no one sort of like one fix
Yes.
as to how we dismantle
And
Islamophobia.
it's so rooted within us too, right? Like this
Yeah,
racism that we have, like
yeah,
everybody kind of experiences it, right?
yeah, yeah,
Throughout history.
yeah, yeah. I think exactly, and I think that's a good analogy, right? You can't dismantle racism because it's sort of like fluidly and snakily adapts to prevailing moments. And I
Mhm.
think Islamophobia is very much like that. But I think for me, one sort of prescriptive outcome of the book is that I want to sort of inspire Muslims to sort of take possession and take control of their stories, right? Be able
Mhm.
to sort of craft, tour their own narratives moving ahead. Because historically speaking, especially when I was growing up as a young kid and then a student, all historical accounts, all public narratives, all cinematic and sort of like television illustrations of Muslims were being constructed and
Mhm.
curated by individuals who didn't like us
Mhm.
and didn't look like us and didn't have our names and
Yes.
didn't practice our faith. So for me, this book is very much a product of rewriting history from a very pointedly Muslim perspective, and that to me is a very, perhaps in my opinion, one of the most sort of important ways in which we can dismantle and deconstruct Islamophobia is we take possession and take ownership of our history and our stories.
Mhm. Mhm. You've also spoken about dismantling Islamophobia just like on a structural level.
Yeah.
So, what role would governments have in that?
Yeah, it's a good question. Yes, I'm a lawyer, right? And before I became an academic, I practiced law for a long time, oftentimes challenging a lot of these policies and laws
Hmm.
that eroded the rights of Muslims after the war on terror. And I want you to think about Islamophobia as like a broader architecture, and that's why my book pushes readers to do.
Hmm.
And the sort of foundation of the architecture of Islamophobia is this sort of layering of laws that enables it to sort of perpetuate through societal, corporate, institutional actors. So we have to challenge these laws, right? In the United States, for instance, we have to challenge laws like the Muslim ban to demonstrate how they're castigating Islam and in violation of constitutional rights and constitutional liberties.
Hmm.
Places like Canada, there was a wide dragnet of surveillance that existed in the post 9/11 context that was being challenged by attorneys here in the States. So having individuals, including attorneys, who challenge these laws is one way in which we can dismantle it. We had an earlier conversation about the role of government in sort of embracing and then entrenching Islamophobia within their, brick and mortar
Hmm.
structures and
Hmm.
buildings. I'm actually opposed to that, right? I think that government should not sort of institutionalize what Islamophobia means because they'll naturally disentangle themselves, right, from being culprits of Islamophobia, right? They'll sort of distance themselves and distance the policies and laws that they pass as not being Islamophobic when in fact they are. And oftentimes when they're often the spearhead of Islamophobic animus in society.
So what's the best way for government to take action against Islamophobia?
Well, I think the best way in which government can take action is to not pass Islamophobic policy,
Okay.
right? And I think that organizations, individuals, attorneys who are external, right, from the state, and not to say we shouldn't have Muslim politicians and parliamentarians, I think that's a good thing, but it has to be challenged from the outside, right? These laws and policies have to be challenged from the outside. So instead of the government opening an office on Islamophobia, why not fund and subsidize a civic organization or a civil rights organization or a media organization that can take the mantle and do it independently?
Professor Khaled, do you ever get tired of talking about or thinking about Islamophobia? Because I feel like I'm looking at your Instagram feed and it's all these stories about, Muslims experiencing Islamophobia. And sometimes I get tired. I feel like, oh, I can't deal with this. I feel terrible about myself just reading about this or watching this. How do you keep going?
Yeah. No, it's funny when I just came from Stanford University and all these young people were telling me, Professor Beydoun, you smile a lot more than we expected. You're a lot less serious than we anticipated before we met you. Yeah, I'm a generally optimistic and happy person.
Okay.
And I can see how it can get bleak and sort of exhausting to see, story after incessant story about Muslim suffering and so forth and so on. I don't view it from that vantage point. I view it more so, and this is why I was really excited when you guys reached out to me to work with you, is that the mainstream media is not doing an effective, even less than effective, an adequate job in addressing stories that are really important to us as a global Muslim community, right? And somebody has to fill that void. I naturally cannot fill that void as one individual, right? But what I can do is to take sort of like ownership and possession of my platform and use it to tell stories, to address concerns, to raise up issues that are entirely being neglected and erased from the mainstream media landscape. So does it get tiring? It does, but it's also a labor of obligation that I think is important to champion, because if we don't champion that, then these stories are going to go largely ignored. Nobody's talking about Uyghur Muslims. Nobody's talking about what's happening to Indian Muslims facing this Hindutva supremacist regime in India. So we have to lift up and amplify those voices.
And Professor Khaled, do you sometimes feel like if we become Islamophobia advocates, advocates against Islamophobia, that we are leaving out some stories? Like, for example, we might be afraid to talk about situations where, Muslim countries, Muslim majority countries are inflicting harm upon a minority.
Yeah. Oh, definitely so. I think that, look, I try to be as even-handed and as capacious in the sort of stories and issues that I address. So I'll give you an example, right? So a couple of days ago, I addressed a story out of Tunisia where the leader of
I saw that, yes.
Yeah, the leader of that country was essentially using anti-Black xenophobia as a way to stir up support for his expanding authoritarian regime. So I'm very critical of Arab governments. I'm really critical of Muslim majority governments. I'm oftentimes afraid to travel to some Arab countries because I might be on some sort of list where I end up, in a prison or something. But I think it's important for us to, not let our commitment to Islamophobia blind us from the injustices that Muslim majority governments, elements, and individuals oftentimes partake in, because there's plenty to address, right? The reason I'll respond to this really quickly and say the reason I'm not so sort of vehement in addressing these issues is because CBS, CBC, the BBC, CNN, the Washington Post, they have no issue addressing when Muslim governments are engaged in illicit activity, when Muslim actors are engaged in nefarious activity. That always makes the front page. That always makes the headlines, right? But it doesn't make the headlines when we're victims and not villains.
Professor Khaled, thank you for joining me today.
Yeah, thanks so much. I really enjoyed the conversation.
Our videos reach people all over the world. We hope you will seize the opportunity to share in the reward from God. Please support us today.